The Big Beat.
Welcome, everybody, to this short, it's a lunchtime debate, so it'll be an hour, but a very timely and important debate. I'm joined by a very exciting panel, which I'll introduce you to in a minute. Just for this hour, we're going to discuss press freedom. This kind of naturally broadens it out to perhaps discussing and telling each other our views on what press freedom is, and indeed what we might think about press today, whether they're good, bad, indifferent, whether that matters. But anyway, that's not for me to talk about. I'm going to instead introduce you to the cracking panel, and as usual for the Battle of Ideas, it's going to be in order of how they speak, and then we're going to go right out to you guys. So to start with, we have Patrick Hayes to my right, a journalist and political commentator and a spiked columnist. He writes for publications like Huffington Post and Free Society, amongst others. Then we're going to have Tim, to my far right, Tim Luckhurst, who's the head of the Centre of Journalism at the University of Kent. He's also author, which is relevant today, of the Responsibility Without Power, Lord Justice Leveson's Constitutional Dilemma, which is not only a great read, but it's free and downloadable, so you can't go wrong, really. And then next left is Professor George Brock, Head of Journalism at the City University London, and author of Out-of-Print Newspapers, Journalism and Business of News in the Digital Age, which is kind of worthy of its own debate, but welcome. And then last but not least, and Professor Roger Grave came here, said yes to this only a few days ago, so I'm very appreciative of this. You may know him as a filmmaker. He's a CEO of the Film of Records, BAFTA Award TV series, all of that kind of thing. But we've got him here because he's, can I say this, an old hack? And a journalist for, absolutely, okay, good, for many a publication, including the Telegraph, Times, The Guardian, and The Sun. So, Patrick, kick us off.
So, I'm really pleased that the IY decided to hold this debate, Leveson 1 year on. And I'm equally very pleased that people here saw fit to turn up, despite the fact that it is lunchtime. Because I think the debate as it currently stands on Leveson runs the risk of becoming an increasingly drawn-out, tedious, legalistic affair that only really sparks interest among an increasingly small elite clique of individuals who are increasingly estranged from public debate. And the seemingly interminable squabbling and tactical game-playing between lawyers, lobbyists, and certain militant academics is indeed deeply uninspiring, as is the recent spot the difference game between the hacked-off politicians-backed Royal Charter and the one that's backed by most national newspapers. I think that's really only likely to appeal to a small, masochistic, perhaps insomniac section of the public. And this isn't to be dismissive of the very real practical implications that this debate is currently having. For example, if it had been decided that no fees could have been charged to make a complaint with this new regulatory body that's being set up by the Royal Charter, there was a very real possibility this could have become a complainants charter, where anyone with any gripes, any lobbyists or ambulance-chasing lawyers could have submitted a complaint with absolutely nothing to lose, absolutely flooding newspapers with complaints and hefty costs as well. And equally, it was very disturbing to read in Private Eye this week that elements of Leveson, quite significant elements of Leveson, are already being implemented. So, for example, in the Crime and Courts Act 2013, it states that when a new regulatory body for the press is set up, any body, any newspaper or magazine that doesn't actually sign up to this regulatory body will actually face exemplary damages. And in most cases, and this is actually very worrying, the Act states that the courts must award costs against defendants. So even if the defendants win the case, then there is a possibility that they will also have to pay costs. So Leveson is already having a very worrying impact, and I think we should take that very seriously. And I think it's very crucial that we don't just get bogged down in the legalistic minutiae of the 2,000-page, million-word Leveson report, because this is, after all, ultimately a debate about whether or not the state should step in and curtail press freedom for the first time in 318 years, since 1695. And we should recognise that I think there's quite a phony war going on here. There's a phony war about degrees of state-backed regulation of the press, because both charters currently being proposed are founded on what I think is fundamentally a lie. And that's that the press is currently too free and needs to be reined in by a more punitive system. And you hear a lot that a decision-making body that has to rein this in has to be made up of individuals who aren't representatives of the media. We hear a lot, and I think we should be dismissive of this, of the doublespeak that is, independent self-regulation. I mean, if ever there was a contradiction in terms, it's the idea of independent self-regulation. And I wanted to, at this stage, really kind of say that I don't want to be too hysterical about this. I don't think we're going to face a situation like we see in the front page of Private Eye this week, where the press is effectively told that they have to put cuddly kittens on the front page of their papers, saying things like, isn't the opposition marvellous? Isn't Hugh Grant's film wonderful? I think it's very important, and I make a very clear distinction between state-backed regulation and state regulation here. Because I don't think, to paraphrase Orwell, state regulation always just means a jackboot stamping on a journalist's head forever. You don't always need outright pre-publication censorship to have a chilling effect on journalism. But at the same time, not living in North Korea is nothing to celebrate. Leveson is already having a very chilling effect, from papers sitting on reports of Rolf Harris's arrest, for example, to nervousness about publishing the nude photos of Prince Harry earlier this year. And there's very serious talk, and this really concerned me, that the press shouldn't even be allowed to say that Ed Miliband's dad hated Britain. I think there's another fundamental lie being told here in this debate that you hear time and again throughout this drawn-out process on Leveson, and that's that regulation is trying to achieve something that is in the public's interest. Throughout the debate, there's been a strong sense that the public interest should be defined by the elite of society, those in the legal, political, media, academic and celebrity worlds. The public interest across the board is evidently seen to be far too important to be left to the public to decide. And I think, I think there's a tendency to use hacked off as a bit of an Aunt Sally in this debate. But I think this quote from Professor Brian Cathcart in his new book, modestly titled Everybody's Hacked Off, is actually really telling. And he says, in defining the public interest, he says, to start with, it's obviously not the same thing as what interests the public, because that would legitimize all kinds of gratuitous cruelty and dishonesty, reviving the morality, he says, that permitted bear-baiting and public executions. And I don't think there's any clearer example of the sheer disdain for the cruel, dishonest public who are far too base in their taste to decide for themselves what they should or shouldn't read in the papers. And I think this elite snobbery is infused throughout every aspect of this current debate. So yes, I think the current debate around whether or not to implement Leveson in full is very much weighed down in legalistic jargon and arcane discussions. But it's too important to let it remain that way. And just to conclude, because fundamentally this discussion is about press freedom and has a wide-ranging consequences for the future of free speech for all of us in the UK. It's too important to be left up to a small elite clique who prefer to stitch up behind closed doors over pizza than actually engage in the debate with journalists or, God forbid, the public. So in this debate, let's not get bogged down asking ourselves about which royal charter will produce a press more amenable to our sensibilities, but instead ask ourselves, are you for a free press with no ifs and no buts, or for a state-backed regulation about what a journalist can or cannot say, and ultimately what we, the public, can or cannot read?
Tim.
I agree with virtually everything that Patrick said. I don't think I'm a masochist or an obsessive, but I am, in academia, quite distinctive in the sense that I actually believe that the 19th century liberals who defined journalism as a fourth estate with a primary duty to hold power to account and speak truth to power defined it much more accurately than those who, since the mid-1960s, have tried to define the news industry as simply a mechanism by which profits are made by selling something called news. I think that is a reductive and absurd description, and one which deserves to be treated with not just scepticism, but actually with contempt. There is another great lie at the heart of the debate over Leveson, and it's the lie about how the Leveson inquiry came about. If you listened to most of my opponents, you would be forgiven for believing that the Leveson inquiry came about because newspapers hacked telephones. I would suggest to you that's about 10% of the truth. I would suggest the Leveson inquiry came about because MPs were embarrassed by the Telegraph's revelation of their expenses claims, because News International was attempting to secure the remaining shares in Big Sky B, because the Prime Minister was embarrassed over his communications director's apparent involvement in alleged misconduct, and because a group of academics and obsessives who, since the foundation of the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom in 1979, have been seeking to abuse every single excuse to impose state regulation of the press because they want a press which represents one side of Britain's political debate and not the other, jumped on the bandwagon and managed to add to the mix this time, a film star who was prepared not simply to fund it, but also to front the campaign. So where are we now? Well, I suggest this. We'll, by the end of next week, have a recognition body with nothing to recognise and an independent press standards organisation that will not meet the criteria for recognition. And I'm supremely relaxed about that. I'm supremely relaxed about that because even if one were to accept Sir Brian Leveson's criteria, and I don't, one would have to understand that what Sir Brian said was that press regulation must be entirely independent of the state and it must be acceptable to the press. He then, when he was speaking to the Department of Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee last month, expressed a degree of bewilderment that the system he proposed has not been deemed to pass either of those tests. Well, as a historian of newspapers, I'm not remotely surprised. Because the only lesson I can draw from looking at the state's role in intervening in and regulating journalism since the abolition of stamp duty in 1855 is that on every single occasion it follows a two-stage process. First, politicians promise that any powers they take over newspapers will not be used. Second, they use them. The history of newspapers since the 1930s is not one of deterioration. If anyone thinks that the hacking of a telephone is worse than the collusion between the Times and other British newspapers and the appeasement faction in the British cabinet, which sought not only to appease Nazi Germany, but actually to create a common sphere of Anglo-German influence. If anyone genuinely believes that phone hacking is worse than that, then I ask them to question their ethical standards. British newspapers have been improving since the 1930s. We actually now have some of the most popular and successful newspapers in the world. The Guardian Unlimited website is the second most popular newspaper website in the world. It illustrates how British newspapers are actually considered outside this country. They're considered as beacons of excellence, which are capable of holding power to account, and which represent the triumph of the liberal ideal. If we compromise the way in which our newspapers are regulated, Patrick's right, we won't suddenly find ourselves with a jackboot on our head in this country, but we will betray utterly people in Africa, in Eastern Europe, and throughout the developing world, who have based their demands for genuine independence of the press upon the British model, and who will be undermined entirely if their governments, who oppose them utterly, are able to say, oh look, Britain has taken a position in which statutory underpinning is tolerated, why shouldn't we? And the signal we will send will be one that we should be ashamed to send.
I'd just like to start very briefly by stepping back from Leveson and indeed Britain for a second and just think for a moment about what is happening to the news business across the world and the role it and the role that press freedom needs to play in it. I think there are three big things that are going on. There is obviously a very big disruption of journalism going on, caused not only by digital technology, although digital technology has been a very big part of that, and it is disrupting what is going on. The book I've just published opens with Paul Dacre basically appealing to the Leveson inquiry before it started to allow the Daily Mail to keep going, doing what it does, otherwise it would be completely overtaken and outcompeted by people, news producers on the internet. Second thing, there is an enormous amount of potential data leakage from governments and big organizations, and that new battleground over that kind of transparency, obviously the Snowden NSA leaks and WikiLeaks are the big and spectacular, but not the only examples of that. And thirdly, I think this is very relevant to press freedom everywhere, is the primacy of government concerns with counterterrorism and surveillance. So I think it is, when we're thinking about phone hacking, Leveson, royal charters, and so on, we're thinking about it, or we should be thinking about it, in those kinds of contexts. Now, I think there are some danger signs in relation to those big trends. It is fairly clear that a lot of legislators, not just MPs, members of the House of Lords as well, if you look at some of the things they've been doing recently, really don't care very much about press freedom. They don't really understand what it means, and they don't care about it. I was in America until Wednesday this week, and a very balanced and sensible American journalist said to me, well, most of my work has been done in an era covered by not only the First Amendment, but a very weakened ability for people to sue for libel. He meant the great legal decision, New York Times versus Sullivan, and also the Supreme Court decision in the Pentagon Papers case, which made it very difficult for the government to convict leakers. And he said that really framed what may now seem to be a golden period. Now we have a democratic president going after journalists, and he wasn't talking about Snowden. He was talking about journalists on publications who have been reporting national security matters and are being chased by the government for doing their job properly. The problem in all this is, however, that waving a free press and nothing else unqualified slogan doesn't solve the problem. I never much liked the idea of the Royal Charter arising out of Leveson, but I was, I think, prepared, probably when I came and spoke here a year ago, to think that it was just about possible to square the circle of regulation. I don't think that now because of what has happened. And if you want a single opinion which crystallizes that for me, it is from a newspaper lawyer called Jill Phillips, who I used to work with at the Times. She now works for The Guardian, and she was at a conference the other day. Somebody said, well, look, net, has Leveson been good or bad? And she said, Leveson has been disastrous. And the only consolation I can take from that, and I make this brief because I'm echoing one of the earlier speakers, is that the kind of thing they are putting into legislation, the government is attempting in its inept way currently to put into legislation, I don't think will work, and I don't think it can work. My impression is that the government is going to try and kick this matter into the long grass and into the election season in which nothing will happen. It's a rather slim consolation, but there it is. I have a modest proposal about what the government should have done to illustrate where I think Leveson went wrong. The key is not who is a relevant publisher or who is a micro business, or all of these idiotic terms that are now finding their way into the legislation for a regulator which the government may now set up and be supported by nobody. The key is the outcome, and the test has to be, even though it is in the hands to some degree, always ultimately, of a government and judges, of public interest. And I think Leveson should have proposed a bargain in which he said to the press, if I put proper public interest defenses in all the laws under which you could be arraigned, you will be able to make use of those public interest defenses, but you will have to show that you have editorial standards and integrity. And if that had been done, if that bargain had been undertaken, I think a third party, independent, genuinely independent, entirely independent regulator would have had to look at what people did in newsrooms, and also, equally importantly, it would have put editors, who are actually the people who can tell whether journalists are misbehaving or not, in charge of the editorial integrity of newsrooms. Would this system have been perfect? No, certainly not, because there is no such thing as a perfect system in these issues. But I'm fairly sure it would have been better than the dog's breakfast the government is currently making of Lord Leveson's recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Roger, get in there.
Okay, yes. Well, you've heard from the lions. I'm the Christian. And I hope somebody's going to applaud what I have to say, because I'm not going to agree with anyone except George's last proposal. I think is a good one. I'm here to speak for the victims. The reason for this was not just political chicanery of the kind that's been described, but it's because the exposure of what was happening to the McCanns, to Chris Jeffreys in Bristol, to the Watsons in Scotland, and others, many others, especially the 2,700, and it's a bigger number now, who were discovered to be the victims of hacking, was producing a public outrage, which, considering my colleagues on the platform talk about the public as though that anyone who supports this with such disdain, I commend them the 20 opinion polls that have been done about this, in which there is a degree of, always in a majority, but degrees of support for something like the independent regulator free of the press. It's also worth your knowing, and it's been left out in our conversation, that this is the 7th attempt to regulate the press since 1947. There have been 3 royal commissions, 3 public inquiries, 2 by Colcott, and at every single one it was announced, this is the last chance, Saloon, you've got to get your act in order, otherwise you're going to get statutory regulation, proper, as it were, real statutory regulation. The press said every time, yes, you're right, absolutely, we're going to do it. They didn't, and 10 years later they had another one. So if we're talking about lies, and I think that's much too strong a word for what's a knotty problem here, there are the lies for you. And then here's an interesting one. I write for the Mail, by the way, and the Mail on Sunday. I'm delighted to write for an audience that doesn't necessarily share my views, and I've always been treated well by the newspapers. But during Leveson, just from November 11 to November 12, the Mail had to issue 9 apologies for intruding into private grief. That the PCC actually managed to wreak from them. That just carried on right through Leveson. There was no change, no investigation into the culture, no fine, nothing. It just kept happening. And I'm just going to tell you a little story for why this side of thing matters. The Watsons lost their daughter in a playground stabbing, only to find that the newspapers then accused the girl of causing her own death by bullying the other girl. The brother was so upset by this that he killed himself. Okay? We are not talking about a bit of celebrity embarrassment here. We're talking about an ordinary family that has that kind of experience. I made a film about the Madeleine case in which we discovered 80 front pages of the Express accusing them in some form or other of killing their daughter. Now you imagine you're a nice couple, from the Midlands who on holiday, you lose your daughter in this ghastly way. For the first few months, you're the heroine and hero of the press, and then suddenly the Portuguese police, who are really, let me tell you, as a criminologist, are not any good at what they were doing, suddenly make them, quote, persons of interest. That switches the British press attitude, and no less than 80 front pages at the end, which cost the Express £500,000, but the damage had been done and the distress had been done. Now just put yourself, these are ordinary people, these are not celebrities. Put yourself in those positions. See what it would feel like. See if your daughter was killed your son was killed in a bus crash in Switzerland, and you found a newspaper had not only published without your permission or even asking, private pictures of the boy, but also had sent a long lens photographer to film the funeral. Now, this is what we're talking about here. None of the other people on the platform have even mentioned the victims. They talk about press freedom as if it were a kind of a goal that was always kind of, as it were, virtuous, speaking truth to power. That's what I do as a journo. That's what I do as a filmmaker. I'm very proud of the chance to do it, but that's not all they do. And as George's suggestion implied, if we could be sure that newspapers used their power responsibly in that way and didn't just pick the wings off butterflies and then issue an apology somewhere in the back of the paper when they were forced to, then there'd be no problem. I believe in a free press, but I think it's closer to what Gandhi said about Western civilization. I think it would be a good idea.
With journalists being amongst the least trusted people next to politicians, is there not a danger that what's going to happen is there's going to be more mudslinging from both sides, and there's just going to be even less trust in both the press and politicians? And is there any way you think that politicians and journalists can perhaps stop this negative cycle?
I'm wondering if we can make the case for a cultural rather than a regulatory shift, both in terms of newspaper content, where people don't want to intrude on private grief, and also putting the editorial together, because a lot of the reporting of phone hacking has kind of presented it as a sort of Secret Service style operation, but the reality has been often phoning people's private numbers in the hope that it would go to answer phone, and then putting in the 4-digit password in the hope they hadn't changed it from the factory setting. So as lazy journalism combined with an appeal to prurient interest among readers, which often aren't even there, what about trying to voluntarily shove those things out rather than have a regulatory solution to it?
It's a trick elevating the victim in this. That's what I find so kind of appalling. If you want to elevate the victim, then we will focus on the victim, right? And the problem is that the issue we are faced with is so much larger than terrible experiences that certain individuals have had at the hands of the press. Nobody's disputing that, and if they can prove it in court, they win libel cases and all the rest of it. The issue is so much larger, and it's a cheap trick to try and elevate the victim to the point that it closes down the debate. And it's a trick that Hacktoff has done beautifully over the last year and 18 months or so. So I would like the other 2, maybe 3 members of the panel to come back and engage with the other chap here who has elevated the argument of the victim over the argument of the free press. Because at the end of the day, freedom of the press is not an argument to say that the press is going to be a good and civil and kind press. It is that the freedom of speech is a dirty business often, but the prerequisite of a free society, a society that can debate publicly its problems and its challenges.
Just to say that, I mean, we get the politicians we deserve, we definitely get the press we deserve as well. If we are going to read story after story after story about Madeleine McCann's parents and what they may or may have done and what kind of parents they're going to be, and be willing to judge those victims, then it is highly unsurprising that we have a press who is willing to print that. Unless we as a society actually stand up and say, you know what, we don't want to know about the victim's family. They were murdered. It doesn't matter what that child or adult may have done. They were murdered. That is wrong. Then maybe we might get somewhere. But you can't expect to have a press that is all good and toothless and is going to be very, very nice to everybody if we're not nice in our own homes when we talk about them kind of behind everyone's backs.
I have every sympathy, actually, for the McCanns and all the other victims of bad press. One of the things about the McCann case was that after the Portuguese police decided to make the parents suspects in a ridiculous fashion, for which there was absolutely no evidence, basically all the British newspapers kind of followed that. I don't think there's any British newspaper that has that can say it treated the McCanns well. However, it is a very different issue. What we're trying to say here is that nothing bad will ever happen to people in the press if we can control what the press say. The problem with a free press is, actually, we haven't got the press that we deserve. We deserve a properly free press, and we don't have one now. I also think that to kind of compare the victims of what happens with a free press with the nature of the free press is just fundamentally wrong. We don't want a free press because the papers always say the right thing. I often read the Mail and the Guardian and the Times, and they almost never say the right thing. It's a little bit like voting and democracy. We all believe in democracy because we understand that's historically the best way to organise society, and there's a lot of evidence for that. We don't then say, oh, well, you can't vote that way, at least not very often. So it's very important that we remember that a free press is about people being able to say what they like. And if they can't, you don't have a free press. I would certainly like to see an awful lot of comeback for the victims of bad press behaviour. But that is not the same as saying, therefore, we can't have a free press. And I'm afraid that I disagree with Professor Brock, because I don't think you can square a circle.
Okay.
No, sorry, I said I don't now think you can.
Come back to him later, but let's start with Tim.
I'd like to address this issue of the exploitation of the victims and thank the guy who raised this vital point, because it links very much to the history which Hacktoff and, with the greatest respect, Roger, you too, exploit so ludicrously. Yes, we have had 7 attempts since 1947 to implement a form of statutory backdrop to press regulation. And yes, it's been rejected 7 times. And one of the reasons it's been rejected 7 times is not because there has been some trend towards statutory backstop, some unpreventable wave of public support for that backstop, but because on each occasion, Parliament has looked carefully at the recommendations made and has concluded that to regulate according to the experience of victims of bad press is to implement a form of vigilante justice. It is to regulate on the basis that the public are victims, not consumers of newspapers. And what Parliament has done on each occasion is actually not to recognise the rights of big newspaper barons, not to prostitute themselves to bribery by powerful media institutions, but rather to say, look, the majority of consumers are actually, the majority of the public are actually consumers of journalism. They benefit from it. And the victims, though they deserve our great respect, have redress in law. And there is redress in law. And the McCanns have had it. And the Dowlers have had it. And I wish it were easier, but that's an issue for the legal profession, not for journalism. That's an issue about access to justice and about the cost of justice. And I will celebrate expanded access and cheaper access to justice. But I will not pretend that all of the offences that Leveson investigated are not already actionable under criminal law or under civil law, because they are, and we're telling another preposterous nonsense.
In a way, you're getting the benefit of exaggeration, and the use of the word lies, preposterous, trick, all of that sort of thing suggests that we really can't have a kind of coherent conversation about this because you guys have made up your mind. I do commend you to look at those opinion polls when we talk about what the public wants, because they are in favor of something that constrains the worst excesses of the press. And secondly, I think it's quite important that you understand there's no prior restraint in the plans. It is only afterwards, and what is being proposed is actually not what the previous 6 inquiries did suggest, which, by the way, weren't rejected by Parliament. They went into the long grass because the power of the press during election time and so on was such, just as George suggests, that nobody wanted to take on the press barons. Talk about power with responsibility, you can see it there. What we're talking about is somebody who would check the independence of a self-appointed regulator in which no press people or politicians would be involved. The press buff, its own idea, actually does involve politicians already, Chris Smith, Lord Black, and so on, and would have press people all over it. So, in a sense, all this, the effort that I'm at least supporting is the idea that that the press itself would do what one of the people in the audience talked about, something to slightly restrain its own worst excesses and prove regularly to this independent regulator that it is doing so, without having to go into the courts, which are now more expensive than ever. I saw that private eye story and was very upset by it myself as a journalist, but at the same time, the conditional fee arrangement, which is no win, no fee, is being removed, and legal aid is also being constrained, so the right of individuals to go to court, which will take a very long time and a great deal of money, is actually shrinking, not expanding. You can separate them by saying, oh, well, that's a different issue, but it isn't. It's part of the same question. The very people, 60, 70% of the people who read the newspapers are also saying we would like them not to be so cruel in random ways. Now, just on the point about speaking truth to power, what about, yes, PRISM? Look at the reaction to PRISM in The Guardian. That was an amazing story which went all over the world in many other places as a major story. What happened here was that the other newspapers attacked The Guardian and supported the government for saying, oh, well, we have to trust the people, the secret services and so on. I wish they would tell more truth to power. That I would be very pleased with.
I can't offer any reassurance to the person who wanted less mudslinging between press and politicians. I'm afraid the best relationship between press and politicians you can have is bound to be fretful. The person who asked about cultural rather than regulatory shift, well, all I can say is that my modest proposal was precisely designed to use cultural incentives, but access to quicker, cheaper access to law is part of it. And actually, I think, Tim takes the view that this wasn't part of Leveson's inquiry. I think Leveson missed a historic opportunity to put his shoulder behind quicker, cheaper access to law.
He was offering free arbitration.
Yeah, he was offering free arbitration, and the arbitration proposals are very good. But I think he could have done. I think he could have done more still. Question of whether or not journalism does harm. The reason I talk about the public interest test, and the public interest has been used to a limited extent in law, is that it gets round this question about whether or not harm is the test. Good investigative journalism does harm to someone. Harm occurs in journalism, and it occurs for good public interest reasons. It can actually create public value in certain circumstances. That's the reason why public interest as a test of the responsibility of journalism is defective, in the sense that lawyers will always argue about it, but nobody has invented anything better than I've ever heard about. I'll leave it at that for the time being.
I said earlier that I think this debate is getting estranged from public debate, and I think one of the marks of this estrangement is endless citing of opinion polls about what to give some kind of sense of what the public think. And actually, in a recent YouGov survey, only 40% of Sun readers said they thought that the Sun should sign up to any new regulatory body. I mean, there are lies, as always, lies and damn lies and statistics, and I think you can. That no amount of opinion polls is any real substitute for public debate. Now, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Tim said, but I'm not quite as optimistic about, the fact that the British press are a beacon of hope around the world, or excellence around the world. I do think that the media in the UK, and this goes across the board from the Sun and the Mail and other tabloids, to also the Guardian and the Independent. I think the media can be narcissistic. I think it can be warmongering, and I think it can be morally driven and attached at the expense a lot of the time of facts. But at the same time, I think there is a question we have to keep coming back to. When we say we're unhappy with it, something should be done, who should make the decision about what we can or cannot read? Who should make the decision about what's right or wrong? Should it be an independent panel of the great and good who are making decisions, apart from the media, apart from even elected politicians, and can chastise the press accordingly? It's a very worrying situation when we're saying that there is this idealised body that can effectively pass down judgment. One thing that I think, for me, brings home the lie about the Leveson inquiry is, and I agree with what Tim said about this, is that, I mean, we have to remember that the Leveson inquiry was set up not to investigate phone hacking, which could have been done. I mean, it was illegal. There could have been a criminal case into the phone hacking, but it was to look at the culture, practice, and ethics of the media. It had a much broader remit. As David Cameron said, when announcing what would become the Leveson inquiry, he said, using almost Orwellian terminology, he said, for a long time, the press have shown truth to power. Now it's time for the power to show truth to the press. And that's a very worrying state of affairs there. And I think one thing that actually brings home the fact that this was, from the start, a witch hunt against the tabloids was the fact that when the Serious Organised Crime Agency revealed that actually only 20% of phone hacking was actually undertaken by the tabloids, and 80% were undertaken by law firms, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals, Leveson, even in the million words of his report, didn't see fit to actually mention this himself. So I think it really brings home the fact that this was, from the very start, a witch hunt against the tabloids, and in no way an attempt to have a reasoned debate around the kind of journalism that we want.
My question is really about double standards. The papers who are most against Leveson have all said this really isn't about us and ordinary individuals, what we may do to ordinary individuals. It's about the worry that we won't be able to hold the state to account. Yet at the moment we have the Prime Minister and ministers pressurising a particular newspaper, forcing a parliamentary inquiry on that newspaper, going into that newspaper and smashing up its hard drives, the state arresting an assistant of a journalist under terrorism charges. Yet those papers who have most said this is an issue about press freedom and standing up to the state opposing journalism are completely silent on this issue. And I'm wondering where that comes from, because to me it's complete hypocrisy from these people who say we must be able to confront the state while they do nothing.
Totally agree.
If you have a body which says what is and is not an acceptable culture for a media organisation, you'll end up with an increasing tend towards a monoculture in the media, and that will have exactly the opposite effect of what the last gentleman wants. By saying this is an acceptable culture in a media organisation, this isn't, you might be throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Thanks for being short.
One thing you can be sure of, if somebody speaks on behalf of victims, they're speaking on behalf of power. It's absolutely the case that in a victim culture, that's how the powerful present themselves, as defending victims. I work in a university, and I work in education. It's increasingly difficult, even when you're supposed to have academic freedom, to criticise the government, to criticise any sort of policies, to actually exercise your academic freedom. And I think I would make a case for journalists being a different subspecies. Right? They always struck me as that. They're not normal. Because they do this thing called they pursue a story to the bitter end, just as academics should pursue truth, in a way. It's the same thing. Not to make a noble story about journalists, but they are this sort of peculiar beast. They do pursue a story, and sometimes it's a bad story and sometimes it's a good story. But they are, because they're allowed to do that, there are something exceptional. And that's to me what a free press means. It's to let these strange creatures pursue a story to the bitter end and to regulate themselves. And not to regulate themselves, just get on with doing the job of being a journalist and pursuing that story.
I was at this debate last year and there was a woman here, I don't know if George remembers her name, on the panel from The Independent. She's no longer a journalist, and if you Google her...
Christina Patterson, I think, was talking about.
Google her, and I hope she's not here. I did see her yesterday, but I'm speaking on her behalf. She's written a heartbreaking article about the end of her career in journalism. I've just read a brilliant book which I recommend called Ink Stained, which is the 20 graduates from Columbia Journalism School 20 years ago. Amazing book. One of them is still a journalist. So I want to put her point in her article, aren't we fiddling while Rome burns? We've had a 2-year discussion about regulation at the time where George says the press is admired all around the world, where the big story is the press is dying. Journalists are no longer journalists. There is a massive crisis out there, and we're discussing whether or not we should have state regulation.
I live in New York quite a lot of the time, and it's interesting in the States where there's formally free speech. Recently, the Justice Department thought it was acceptable to seize the telephone records of 20 Associated Press journalists. It's now also acceptable to hold both James Risen and James Sterling in contempt, one on espionage charges. The charges are based on issues of the state and freedom and terror. But there's an analogy here. I was just in the Czech Republic, where there's a muzzling law that was brought in 2009 because people were so outraged that photos of young children who'd been in obscenity issues were distributed in the press. Very, very outrageous. We can all say that we sympathise with that idea, and yet then it becomes generalised to muzzle the press. And then we see it here, and really, in a way, I want to say it's incredible, because I was in Eastern Europe, and people were talking about some of the things happening there. But in Britain, 300 years of press freedom kind of gets dispensed with. I'd go even further than a strange species. I'd say even rummaging around the garbage, putting the snout in the muzzle, all of that stuff is really important in terms of freedom of speech, which once you start limiting it in any sense, we've dispensed with it, and we need it in our press now more than ever.
Double standards, the NSA, and what goes on in the United States. I drew attention to precisely that point at the beginning of my presentation because I'm worried about what is going on in the UK and the US in the general sense of press freedom. Leave aside Leveson for 1 second, because there are governments doing bad things. And I couldn't agree more with the person who talked about the double standards over the NSA and Snowden. We cannot defend freedom of expression or freedom of publication on the grounds that everything that is produced under that heading is of equal value. If you try to defend press freedom from saying that absolutely everything that is published, and don't forget we're now in a world where anyone can publish to anyone, you're just going to end up in a complete mess. And that is the reason why, sorry to repeat it and I'll do it extremely briefly, that public interest tests in the end in this issue are really going to matter. On the question of fiddling while Rome burns, the book I have just produced, which I will be signing later, deals with precisely that subject. But can I reassure the guy who said we deserve a free press and we don't have one? My book is actually reasonably optimistic about what is going on. Yes, jobs are being lost. Yes, things are shrinking. But actually, there is a vast amount of regeneration happening, and you'll find it in the second two-thirds of the book.
I certainly wouldn't want to defend the idea that everything that's said in the media is of equal value, and I think there is a dangerous relativism that you could lapse into in that sense. The key question is, who should decide, who should be the arbiter of what good and bad journalism is? I think the Christina Patterson article is sad, and I think there are real threats that the journalist industry is facing at the moment. I mean, I think there are dangers, for example, that we're seeing, as Nick Davis has pointed out in his book Flat Earth News a long time ago, that we're seeing the rise of journalism where journalists do not have the time or really the inclination to start to investigate stories that could take several months to really kind of get to the heart of, rather instead they're just churning out press releases and they're starting to just look at the topsoil rather than really getting to the heart of stories anymore. But I think at the same time, journalism will live on, if not in newspapers. We are seeing increasingly people turning online, as we are doing at Spiked, and really trying to invest time and energy into producing new forms of journalism and inquiry and of speaking truth to power ultimately will have to continue.
Of course, not all journalism's good, but the freedom that permits the excellent stuff is essential, even though it occasionally permits bad stuff too. On the response to The Guardian's excellent revelations about PRISM, the NSA, etc. Look, one thing newspapers have historically been bad at is recognising the value of their rivals. But we have in this country a wonderful media ecology. Traditionally, newspapers have defended broadcasters when broadcasters which are regulated by the state are attacked by the state. And they have done a fantastic job of doing that since Suez and constantly and continually throughout the 20th and 21st century. I'm delighted to say that over The Guardian's superb work, our broadcasters stepped into the breach and maintained the pressure on the government and helped The Guardian. That's a great thing, and it reminds us of how badly we need our mixed ecology of an entirely free press and a slightly regulated broadcasting system. Finally, there's a crisis in journalism, yes, but nearly all of my graduates got jobs in journalism last year. They will this year. If you've got multimedia skills and you can work in the internet and online environment, there's a fantastic job to be done, and young, multi-skilled people are doing it.
One thing I will agree about, and that is journalism, the 24-hour pressure and having to post all these stories online is undermining the capacity to do investigative journalism. But I don't want you to get this all out of proportion and say for 300 years we've had this idealized free press. In fact, what we've had is something that you need to understand and the dynamics of, and absolutely the freedom to say what we want to, I protect. But I also think victims have rights, and the person who accused me of being part of a power block that misuses victims, I think that's just misunderstanding it, and I hope it doesn't happen to you. That's all I can say. The actual right, there's a complaints procedure already with the PCC. It's absolutely pointless. Everybody, even many people agree already, which is why they're trying to strengthen it. All the proposals are at the moment is to make sure that whatever is set up as a complaints procedure is independent and cheap, or even free if possible, and therefore ordinary people won't have to go to court and spend a fortune and maybe lose it in order to protect themselves from damage. That's, I think, common humanity. And since everyone's speaking on behalf of the public and people as if they didn't have an opinion, and I commend the polls to you, that's common humanity I would like to see as the basis of what we do.
I just want to take up that last point of our common humanity. I mean, I think what's at stake here is actually fundamental issues. Any regulation of the press is actually regulation of the public's, our freedom to speak, to write, to hear, to listen and to read. As such, it's actually an attack on our humanity as Aristotle defined it. And I think it's really striking that we have demands for press regulation, unprecedented demands for press regulation at a time when common humanity has more opportunities of technically being able to make themselves and read and participate in the public media.
Surely the debate over the implementation of a regulatory body is slightly elementary anyway. I mean, it's not really considering the future of the spread of information. We live in an era when individuals themselves become journalists when they see something through a window and they put it on Facebook or Twitter, and that gets sent out. So really, it's more of a question about why we're trying to prevent the press doing something that individuals do anyway, I think. We're not really considering the real scope of the question.
Roger, you began by saying you were speaking for victims, and you concluded by citing Gandhi to the effect that a free press would be a good idea. I would like you to explain what sort of free press do you have in mind. I do not understand how you can have a freedom which doesn't embrace within it the freedom to exercise judgment, the freedom for journalists to take risks, and also, sadly, the freedom sometimes for journalists to get it wrong. Now, How can you have a freedom that doesn't embrace all of those possibilities? To my mind, you're using the expression freedom of the press, which is actually anything but free. And if I'm wrong about that, then please explain why.
That's a very good question, and thank you for that, and also to speak to the humanity point. This is not about regulating the press. This is about making sure that the consequences of misjudgments actually are acted on. That's all it's about. It is not, there's no prior restraint in these proposals. It is not about people sitting in judgment about whether people should or should not publish this or that beforehand, and it isn't state regulation of the press any more than the VAT £600 million exemption for the press is state regulation either, and that would be much more easy to be revoked if the politicians wanted to do it. I'm in a very odd position here because not only does everybody in the audience seem to have made up its mind, it's also arguing about something that I'm not defending. I don't want the press regulated. I just want it, when they get something wrong and are going to apologize, that they learn from that and the people who are victims of it get something proper without having to go to court, which is a disaster for everybody.
I've said a number of things here and in print critical of Leveson and his inquiry, but I'm just on the point about humanity and also on the point about implementing things. I'm just going to say one thing in defense of Leveson, which is he did one thing which was completely different to previous public inquiries anywhere near this subject, which is that he did not write a distilled, impersonal judge's report. He laid out all the evidence. He spends virtually no time on the celebrities. What he does do is tell the story of what happened to the people who fell foul of popular papers who were not celebrities first. And there was some fairly inhuman behaviour. To pretend that this can't be a problem or to minimise it is just silly. There is a very, very difficult issue about what to do with it, but to pretend that it doesn't exist seems to me a bit daft. On the question of implementation, one of the things that did go wrong with Leveson was that he really didn't consider the implications of let's just call it intrusive digital equipment. If somebody flies a pilotless drone with a camera over J.K. Rowling's garden, it is not likely that this is going to be done by something that Leveson insists on calling, in a rather antique fashion, the press. There is nothing that he proposes is going to help with that kind of problem as far as I can see, and yes, probably privacy law is going to have to be updated by other people.
I just want to end by reminding people of where we actually are. Roger makes the hacked off case in the way that the people who back hacked off always do make the hacked off case. But the truth is that we are in a position in which 8 politicians meeting in a medieval institution sanctioned by a hereditary monarch are seeking to draw up a charter by which the state will provide a backdrop to regulation of the press. And if anybody believes that that is an acceptable way of defending free speech, then I suggest that they're in need of some serious help. This is state regulation of the press. Hacktoff's huge lie has been to pretend that an oxymoron does not exist. State-backed regulation of the press is state regulation of the press. That's what it is. And if we have it in this country, no, we will not have a jackboot on our heads. But our ability to scrutinise the victims of real abuse by the state, will be substantially diluted. And I do not think it is an acceptable position for Britain to be in the 21st century.
When we are talking about state regulation, I think it's important that we don't just think that we're talking about a jackboot against journalists' heads. We're talking about actually something far more insidious than that, which is a creeping culture of conformism among journalists, where it's very much behave or else. So if you do not, if you do dig around in affairs, in private affairs, then we will punish you. If you do publish something that we dislike, then we will fine you as a result. It's not just about pre-publication censorship. The way in which it impacts upon the the mentality of the editor, of the journalist who's investigating a story is very, very important, and that can and already is creating a very chilling climate. But I just wanted to finish by saying I think it's very important we don't get snooty about what gets published by the press. I think the duty of a free press really is to publish and be damned. And I think we should call for more diversity, more irreverence, and more scandalous stuff in the papers, and less of a monoculture where we're all very kind of scared to say boo to a goose or to basically dig up any dirt in case Leveson or this independent self-regulator disapproves of what we say. I just wanted to end with a quote from Frantz Fanon, because I think who's a hero of mine and of Spike's, which is that a free press can be good or bad, but an unfree press can only be bad. And I think that's very important to bear in mind.